The kitchen door stands open to a driving rain. That is the first thing you need to understand about Susanna Hartley. Not her face, not her circumstance, not the £2.07 that constitute the whole of her savings stitched into the lining of her second-best apron, but the kitchen door, and the fact that she is the one who opened it. It is early November at Yardwood Hall, and the estate is the kind of place that announces its own decline before you have dismounted. The iron gates at the lodge have shed their gilding down to bare black metal. The elm avenue that once formed a proper cathedral arch over arriving carriages now permits the sky through gaps where 3 trees were felled in the storm of 1813 and never replaced. The stumps gone green with lichen, and the ground between them soft as a sponge underfoot. The stone of the east wing is stained with 40 years of English weather. 2 upper windows are boarded, and the boards have been there long enough to develop a respectable moss. The kitchen garden wall is split at its southern corner, a crack wide enough to admit a hand. The pigeon loft above the brewhouse has been empty since Sorrel sold the birds the previous spring, and the square hole where they entered and exited now serves only to let the weather in and the warmth out. Anyone arriving at Yardwood in the autumn of 1819 might be forgiven for concluding that the house was in the last stages of something terminal. They would be only partly wrong. The man responsible for this condition was not the absentee duke who had not set foot on English soil since 1808. It was his steward, a man named Sorrel, cold-eyed, punctual, and as methodical in his thieving as a clerk in his ledger work. Under his management, timber was sold at private rates to a cousin in the next county. Tenants were dunned beyond the terms of their leases, and the household accounts were cut to a point that left the senior staff permanently underpaid and permanently anxious. Repairs were quoted, approved in correspondence, and never executed. The money passed through Sorrel's hands in one direction only. He had been doing this for 7 years, and he had the particular confidence of a man who has been doing something unpunished long enough to mistake impunity for innocence. It was into this household that Susanna Hartley had come 3 years before as assistant cook, and it was here that she had steadily, without plan or ambition, made herself indispensable. She was 24. She had a plain face with a high forehead and steady grey-green eyes, and she moved through a kitchen the way a competent surgeon moves through a theatre, purposefully, without wasted motion, fully aware of everything happening at once. The cook, Mrs. Platt, trusted her absolutely, which was fortunate for Mrs. Platt, who was 61, arthritic, and preferred to direct the day's work from a Windsor chair beside the range. The maids trusted Susanna in a different register, the way one trusts a steady railing on a narrow stair. Not ostentatiously, not with any particular tenderness, but as a practical matter. The kind of trust that asserts itself only when the railing is not there. Among the maids, the one who followed closest was Polly. Polly Finch was 16 and had been at Yardwood for 8 months, arriving from her family's farm in the next village, with red hands, round eyes, and a disposition that veered between eager chatter and complete paralysis, depending on whether Sorrel was anywhere in the building. When he was not, she laughed at things that were not quite funny, and dropped spoons and asked questions about everything she saw. When his boots were heard on the servants' stair, she went rigid and silent, and managed to make herself invisible by some talent that approached the supernatural. She had attached herself to Susanna with the devotion of a stray cat that has found the one warm hearth in a wet autumn. And Susanna bore this with patience and a good deal of quiet affection she would not have named aloud. The other figure who matters here is Thomas Crane, footman, 22, lean and dark-haired, with a habit of standing in doorways as though he had not quite committed to entering a room. His family had worked a holding on the estate's southern edge until 3 years prior, when Sorrel had manufactured a pretext to clear them off the land over a disputed fence repair that Thomas's father maintained he had never been obligated to make, and Sorrel's paperwork said otherwise. Thomas's father was now in Bristol, doing work he had not trained for. His mother and sisters had gone to her brother's house in Somerset. Thomas himself had come to the Hall at the recommendation of the old under-butler, who had recognised in him a steadiness worth preserving. He was a good footman. He was also a young man who had not forgotten that his family's farmhouse stood empty and slowly collapsing, and who watched Sorrel each day with the patient, expressionless attention of someone waiting for the right moment. It was Thomas who noticed the man at the kitchen door first. He had come in from the stables through the back passage, still damp from the horses, and he registered the figure standing at the open door the way one registers an unexpected variable, quickly, without expression, filing it for consideration. A stranger. Tall, lean to the point of rawness, wearing a coat that had once been good and now was not, and a hat with the brim pulled low. He had spoken to Mrs. Platt, who had looked at him with a particular combination of pity and firmness she reserved for anyone she had no authority to help. Sorrel's instructions about strangers at the kitchen door were perfectly clear. Mrs. Platt was a kind woman who followed instructions she disagreed with, which is its own kind of compromise. The stranger accepted the refusal without argument. Most men in that condition pressed or grew sharp. This one only nodded, with a gravity that seemed disproportionate to a cold kitchen step, and stepped back from the threshold into the rain. Thomas went about his business. But he did not go far. Susanna had been in the still-room, working through the last of the season's preserving by candlelight, her breath visible in the cold air between the shelves of sealed jars. The rain had begun around 3 in the afternoon with no particular announcement, and had intensified by 6 into something purposeful, a cold, slanting downpour that smelled of wet straw and coal smoke, coming in at the still room's single north-facing window as a fine mist that settled on her forearms and beaded on the jar lids. She had come through to the kitchen to bank up the range for the evening, and on the way she passed the small parlour where the 3 youngest children of the head groom and Mr. Hartley had been deposited by their harried mother, 2 girls and a boy of 4, 5, and 7, all 3 fighting sleep in front of a fire that had burned down to ash. Susanna rebuilt it without comment, knelt to tuck the youngest girl's feet back beneath the rug, and then went on to the kitchen. She had not been asked to do any of that. She simply did it. It was when she reached the kitchen and felt the cold gust through the open door that she understood something had just been sent away. She did not ask Mrs. Platt. She went to the larder, wrapped a slice of cold mutton and 2 pieces of bread in a piece of cloth she kept folded in her apron pocket for no planned purpose, and slipped the bundle in beside her other hand. Before she went, she pressed her fingers against her apron's deeper pocket. The rose cutting was there. She checked for it the way some women check for keys. Jonas Croft was the only remaining garden labourer who had been at Yardwood long enough to remember the 5th Duke's occupancy, and he was 67 and bent nearly double by what he called his trouble, and the village doctor had called a curvature that would not be corrected. He had told Susanna about the rose 3 weeks earlier, on an afternoon when she had noticed he was not eating, and had brought him broth and sat with him while he drank it. The plant grew against the south wall of the old kitchen garden, in the one corner the deer had not pushed through, and its proper name was something in Latin he could no longer recall, only that it had come to England with the 5th Duke's mother, brought back from Flanders in 1751, and planted with her own hands in freshly turned Yardwood soil. It had survived 7 decades and 2 bad winters through the care of successive head gardeners, and lately through Jonas alone. He had taken a cutting in October, 1 green slip no thicker than a pen, wrapped it in damp cotton from his own shirt, and pressed it into Susanna's hands, with the seriousness of a man conveying something of legal weight. He had said, without sentiment, that he intended to keep the parent bush alive until the true master returned, and that he had wanted someone younger to carry the cutting forward in case he did not manage it. Susanna had not argued with him. The sentence contained more faith than she was equipped to contest. She had kept the cutting and checked it each morning the way you check on something fragile and obstinate. She stepped out into the yard. The rain hit her face immediately, and for a moment the shock of it stopped her entirely. The cold was absolute. November cold with no courtesy in it, coming sideways past the stable block in grey curtains. The courtyard stones were slick and dark. The stranger was already at the gate arch, his back to her, in motion. She did not call out. She ran. Her boots found the wet cobbles with more confidence than elegance, and she caught him just as he reached the arch, where the stone overhead granted a moment's relief from the worst of the rain. She took his hand, his left hand, the one nearest to her, and pressed the cloth-wrapped bundle into his palm before he had fully turned. Then, because her other hand was already in her pocket, she pressed the rose cutting into his palm as well, the damp cotton wrapped around it. She had not planned that. She could not have said, even moments afterward, precisely why she did it. She had simply known, in the way that practical people sometimes know things before they can explain them, that the cutting needed to go with him. He looked at her. His eyes were grey, not the vague grey of changeable light, but a deliberate and particular grey, the colour of old iron or still water before dawn. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years more, with a face that had been better maintained in other years and now wore its weather as a permanent feature. But the eyes were clear and still, and he looked at her with a focus so complete that the rain seemed to pause around the edges of it. It was the look of a man not watching but memorising, as though he were committing a debt to record. Susanna pulled her hand free and ran back through the rain to the kitchen door. Inside, she pressed her back against the passage wall and listened to her own breathing slow. Her right hand was shaking. She held it flat against her thigh until it stopped, which took longer than she would have preferred. Then she wiped the rain from her face with her apron, went to the range, and banked it up as she had intended. She heated the remaining broth for Polly, who had materialised from somewhere and was watching her with very large eyes.
"Are you all right then?"
Polly said. "Perfectly well," Susanna said. "Eat your broth before it skins over." Polly ate her broth. Thomas Crane, still in the passage doorway, said nothing at all. He had seen her go out into the rain. He had watched her through the kitchen window as she pressed the food into the stranger's hands. He had seen the man's face in the moment before he turned away. Thomas Crane, who had been watching carefully for 3 years, filed that image alongside the others. What no one in the kitchen knew that evening was what the stranger had done next. He had not left. He had crossed the courtyard at a different angle, keeping close to the stable wall, and made his way to the tack room, whose small, high window faced back across the cobbles toward the kitchen. The glass was dirty, and the rain had not improved it. But through it, a square of warm yellow light was visible. And within that light, the young woman who had run out into the rain to find him was now moving between the range and the table with the same unhurried competence she apparently brought to everything she touched. He could see, at the edge of the frame, a child's foot sticking out from under a rug by the fire. He stood at that window a long time. His name, though no one in the house had yet spoken it, because no one in the house had yet recognised him, was Edward Ravenscourt, 8th Duke of Yardwood. And he had arrived at his own estate for the first time in 11 years, travelling under a false name, with a surveyor's notebook in his coat, and a very clear-eyed understanding of what he expected to find. He had expected neglect. He had found it. He had expected a staff accommodated to the steward's arrangements through long repetition. He had found that too, mostly. But he had also found this. He turned the cloth-wrapped bundle over in his hands. The rose cutting lay in his palm, a small green slip with no obvious future, wrapped in a scrap of someone's shirt. 11 years is a long time to be away from a gesture made without calculation. He could not, at that moment, have catalogued precisely what it cost him. Only that something in the set of him that had been held at formal distance for 11 years had, not broken precisely, but shifted, the way a door shifts in its frame when the weather changes. He wrapped his fingers around the cutting and put it in his coat pocket. He spent 3 days at Yardwood before he declared himself. This was deliberate. He had not come back to England to conduct a rescue, not in the sense of arriving on horseback at the critical moment, which was the kind of thing that solved nothing and left the underlying machinery intact. He had come back to understand what was wrong and in what order it needed to be addressed. And those 3 days, moving through the estate under the name of a surveyor sent by a London firm that did not exist, gave him what he needed. He walked the fields in the mornings with a notebook he actually used, measured fence lines that had not been maintained and hedgerows cut at the wrong angle, and drainage channels that had silted because no one had been paid to clear them. He inspected the mill and found the wheel sound but the gearing worn, a repair of perhaps £12 that had been listed as a quote of 58 in accounts he had reviewed at his solicitor's office in London before departing. He ate his meals in the servants' hall, where no one paid him particular attention because strangers from survey firms were an occasional enough feature of the landscape to be unremarkable, and because Sorrel had given instructions that visiting professionals were to be accommodated without excessive conversation. Sorrel himself he observed with the attention of someone who has been misled for a long time and is now checking the specific mechanism of the deception. The steward was in his mid-40s, with a careful, colourless face and the bearing of a man who had spent years cultivating the appearance of competence at the expense of actually developing any. He managed by intimidation, which works well on people who have no recourse, and Sorrel had ensured, through the particular structuring of the household's complaints procedure, that recourse was very difficult to find. He had the support of the Dowager Duchess Helena, the Duke's mother, who had been residing at the Dower House for 9 years since her husband's death, and who had long since ceased to have any very active interest in estate management, preferring to have something quiet and functional rather than something honest. She had not asked too many questions of Sorrel because he had given her sufficiently comfortable answers, and she had repeated this arrangement so many times that it had, for her, become indistinguishable from trust. By the morning of the 4th day, the Duke had sufficient material in his notebook to proceed. What finally moved his timetable was not strategy. It was a scene through the East Wing corridor, which he had entered on the pretext of measuring the window frames. Sorrel had caught Susanna there, near the door to the old book room, and was addressing her with the quiet precision of a man who has learned that cruelty delivered in a level voice is harder to report than cruelty delivered loudly. He was telling her that her contract of service would not be renewed at the December quarter, and that the reason, which he would not trouble to formalise in writing, was that she had given provisions to an unauthorised visitor without seeking approval, and that a cook's assistant who could not follow the household's instructions regarding kitchen security was not a cook's assistant the estate could keep. He said all of this looking slightly past her left shoulder, and he delivered it without heat, which made it worse. Susanna did not argue. She said, in a voice entirely level, "I understand you, Mr. Sorrel." She turned and walked back down the corridor. Sorrel watched her go with the expression of a man completing an entry in a ledger. The Duke, standing 15 feet away in the shadow of an open doorway with a notebook in his hand, made a different kind of entry. He declared himself that afternoon, in the great hall, at the hour when the senior household staff were assembled for Sorrel's weekly account of the coming week's requirements. A ritual Sorrel had instituted because it was an efficient way to make clear to everyone simultaneously that he was the functioning authority. The Duke walked in through the main doors, which no one had used in years, and which required Thomas Crane's shoulder to open, and he stood in the cold November light falling from the high windows, and said, in a voice pitched to carry, that the survey was complete and that he had a few matters of business to discuss before any of the week's requirements could be properly addressed. He set his notebook on the table. He removed the false name he had been using with the same briskness with which he might have removed a borrowed coat. He said his name and his title, and then he waited. Sorrel's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, none of which he finished before the next one arrived. The Dowager Duchess Helena was not present in the hall. She had been sent for, and she arrived 12 minutes later, by which time the first phase of the conversation was complete. She came through the side passage in her house shoes, which she had not had time to exchange, and she found her son standing at the long table with Sorrel's account books open in front of him, and Sorrel himself seated, uninstructed, in the chair nearest the door. The Duke let the silence acknowledge her arrival, and then he said, "Mother, I think you should sit down." She sat down. She had always been a practical woman in emergencies, whatever her habits in ordinary time. The specifics of what followed in that hall, the documents, the entries identified and explained and then identified again, the moment when Sorrel stopped attempting denial and moved to a different kind of calculation, those specifics belonged to lawyers and to Thomas Thorne, the Duke's London solicitor, who would arrive 3 days later in a hired coach with a clerk and a locked case, and the particular expression of a man who has been briefed in writing but prefers to form his own conclusions in person. Thorne was 53, sharp-featured, with the economical movements of a man who bills by the hour and has internalised the principle. He was sceptical of everyone as a professional matter, and he was sceptical of Susanna specifically as a particular matter. A young woman of no formal standing, whose name kept appearing in accounts of the household's recent history, with a frequency that he associated, in his experience, with one of two things: genuine virtue or a very sophisticated position. He treated her, for the first 2 days, with careful professional neutrality, which she recognised and matched without apparent effort. What changed his assessment was not charm, it was the letter. Susanna had found it in the East Wing, the morning after the hall reveal, while she was doing what she did in moments of uncertainty, which was to make herself useful in a room that needed tidying. The East Wing had been closed since the summer, and smelled of cold, damp and old paper, the smell of a house breathing very slowly. The bookroom shelves held 2 decades of accumulated volumes in no useful order. Estate histories beside novels, beside agricultural journals, beside the kind of improving literature that is given as gifts and never opened. She had been reorganising the lower shelves when a thin volume of sermons, its spine creased open near the middle, had offered up a folded paper tucked between pages that had plainly been used as a marker and then forgotten. The letter was dated 5 years earlier. The hand was elderly but precise, with a quality of care in its formation that suggested someone for whom letters had once been a serious business. It was addressed to Edward Ravenscourt, Duke of Yardwood, care of his solicitor in London, and it described, in the measured and specific language of someone who had been watching carefully for a long time, the sale of 7 acres of estate timber in the summer of 1814 to a buyer named in the letter as Sorrel's cousin, at a price that represented perhaps 35% of market value. It gave dates, quantities, and the name of the carter who had moved the wood. It was signed, "Your great-aunt, with constant affection and diminishing patience, Cornelia Ravenscourt." Susanna read it twice. Then she folded it again, put it back in her apron pocket. She was beginning to feel that her aprons were functioning as a kind of archive, and said nothing to anyone. She did not know, and would not have presumed to determine, whether this letter had ever reached its intended recipient. She knew that it had clearly not been acted upon, and she knew that Lady Cornelia, whoever she was, had written it with a care that deserved better than to remain as a bookmark in a volume of sermons in a cold, abandoned room. She kept it because it was proof that someone in the house had seen clearly and had tried, through legitimate means, to say so. It felt, in a way she could not entirely account for, like the letter was still trying. When Thorn arrived, she observed him for 2 days in the same spirit in which she observed most things, carefully and without announcing her observation. On the 3rd day, she found him alone in the library with a cold cup of tea and a frustrated set to his mouth, and she asked him, without preamble, whether he would find it useful to have a letter in Lady Cornelia Ravenscourt's hand, describing the 1814 timber sale in specific and dated terms. Thorn looked up from his papers. He said, "Yes, I would find it extremely useful." She placed the letter on the table in front of him, went and made him a fresh cup of tea, and left him to read. He came to find her afterward with an expression that had entirely abandoned the professional neutrality of the previous 2 days. He said he had one question. Why had she not produced it immediately upon finding it? She said she had wanted to know whether he was someone who would use it correctly before she put it in his hands. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Fair enough," in the tone of a man who has revised an estimate significantly upward. The first Sunday after the hall reckoning, the Duke walked with Susanna to the village church. This was his decision, made without advance announcement. He had observed that she walked to the 8 o'clock service alone, and on that particular morning he was standing at the front door in his coat and hat when she came down the stairs, and he fell into step beside her without explanation. She did not ask for one. They walked the mile to the village in the November cold, along a lane where the hedgerows had gone brown and bare, and the ground was iron hard with the first serious frost of the season. And they said very little, because they were not yet practiced in saying anything. But it was not an uncomfortable silence. The congregation of St. Edmund's was accustomed to its own business. What it was not accustomed to was the Duke of Yardwood, absent for a decade and returned with enough recent drama to sustain several months of conversation, arriving at its 8 o'clock service and sitting in the Yardwood pew beside a cook's assistant. The responses that morning were delivered with a degree of distraction that the young curate, conducting his 4th service in the living, was not entirely sure how to manage. He managed it by going slightly faster. In the churchyard afterward, a woman named Mrs. Denley, 68 years old, married to the farmer who held the largest tenant holding on the estate's eastern edge and possessed of opinions she considered too well-founded to keep to herself, pushed through the cluster of departing worshippers until she was standing directly in front of Susanna. She took both of Susanna's hands in her own, which were broad and warm despite the cold, and said in a carrying voice that the Lord had rewarded patience and goodness, as he had always promised to do, and that she hoped Miss Hartley would remember old Mrs. Denley when she was a great lady, because Mrs. Denley had said from the first that this day would come, and she intended to hold that on record. Susanna opened her mouth and then closed it. The Duke, standing 2 feet to her left, did something with his face. It was not precisely a smile. It was the thing that happens before a smile, when the muscles responsible have not quite been called upon in a long time and require a moment to locate themselves. But it was visible, and it was real, and it was seen by several members of the congregation who had not previously believed the Duke capable of such a thing. 3 days after that, on a Tuesday afternoon with a pewter sky and the smell of coming snow in the air, Sorrel was formally removed from the estate with a constable and a document from Thorn, and the Dowager Duchess Helena departed for her sister's house in Bath with 2 trunks and the expression of a woman beginning a very long period of private reckoning. By 4 o'clock, the hall was quiet. Susanna was standing beside her packed box, one box, serviceable brown leather, its brass fittings dull with use, when the Duke came in. She had packed it not because she was certain of leaving, but because it had seemed, in the uncertain hours of the morning, important to know that she could. The box was a fact. Facts were useful. He crossed the hall without hesitation. He stopped at a distance of perhaps 2 feet, which was closer than the formal distance that had governed all their previous exchanges. And he looked at her with the same direct, registering attention he had given her in the rain that first night. He said, "I am asking you to be my wife." No preface, no conditional, no apology for the timing or the inadequacy of the setting or the box on the floor between them. She looked at him for a long moment. The hall was cold, the fire unlaid since the housekeeper had left with the steward's household, and the grey afternoon light through the high windows turned everything in the room to the same flat, honest shade. "No, Asher," she said. "Not like this." He said nothing. She went on. She said that she understood what he was doing. She said she was not ungrateful for it, and that she did not mistake it for anything small. But she said that she had been a provision made in extremity once already that day. She gestured briefly at the box. And that she did not wish to be one again. She said that a man who was grateful could express his gratitude in many forms, and that what she was being offered felt, in its present shape, more like the settling of a debt than the beginning of a life. She was not a reward. She was not a solution. She was a person who had made choices in this house, without knowing what they would cost. And what she wanted, if she was to bind herself to anyone, was to be wanted in the same spirit. She stopped. The hall was very quiet. The Duke held her gaze through all of it. When she finished, he stood still for one more breath, and then he inclined his head, a deliberate bow, not the social reflex of courtesy, but the slower, heavier kind that means something has been received. He said nothing. He picked up her box, set it by the door to indicate it was not going anywhere, and walked out of the hall. The box sat there in the cold, grey light, and Susanna stood where she was. And what hung in the air between her and the closed door was not a resolution, but a question she had just, for the first time, made him responsible for answering. The box stayed by the door for 4 days. No one moved it. This was partly practical. Susanna was, after all, still employed, the Duke having made no contrary instruction, and partly something else. The kind of institutional hesitation that descends on a household when the rules it has operated under have been publicly dismantled and the new ones have not yet been handed down. Polly walked around it each morning with the careful lateral arc of someone navigating a sleeping dog. Thomas carried his coal scuttle past it with his eyes front. Mrs. Platt, whose relationship with ambiguity was largely domestic and could not extend to symbolic luggage, finally draped a clean cloth over it on the 3rd morning, which solved the visual problem without addressing any other kind. Susanna herself did not look at it. She went about the work of the kitchen with her accustomed focus, which in the days following the steward's removal had expanded considerably, because a household that has been run tightly by intimidation discovers, when the intimidation is withdrawn, an astonishing number of things that have been deferred. The larder needed a full inventory. The servants' hall coal was 3 weeks behind where it should be for November. The east wing's broken window, boarded since August, was admitting a thread of wind that had found its way by some architectural argument through 2 corridors and into the back stairwell. Susanna addressed these things in sequence, not because anyone asked her to, but because they were there and she was the person who had noticed them. It was in the middle of this self-appointed effort, specifically while she was on her knees beside the larder floor, recounting the preserved goods and noting, with controlled disapproval, that 6 jars of the summer's damson preserve had been quietly removed from the shelves without record, that she heard the sound of a carriage on the front drive, which no one had used since the Dowager Helena's departure. Mrs. Atherton arrived on a Wednesday in late November with 2 trunks, a hat box, and a reputation that had preceded her by about 36 hours. The Duke had written to her the previous week, apparently with the same efficiency he applied to all logistical problems: finding the right person, making the offer in plain terms, and letting the answer constitute itself without embellishment. Margaret Atherton was a widow of 44 who had spent 8 years as housekeeper at Dawnfield Park on the Lincolnshire border before her employer's death had dissolved the household. She was plump in the way of a woman who takes pleasure in what the kitchen can produce and has no philosophical objection to the evidence. With quick brown eyes and the kind of unguarded expression that invites confidence without demanding it. She smelled of lavender, not in the effusive way of a woman over-applying a scent, but in the settled, pervasive way of a woman who keeps lavender sachets in every drawer and has done so for 20 years, so that the scent has become simply part of the atmosphere she carries. She found Susanna in the larder and introduced herself without ceremony. She said she had been told the household was in a state of reorganisation and that she preferred to see it herself rather than receive a summary. And could she begin with the accounts? Susanna handed her the ledger she had been keeping for the past 3 days in the absence of any official record. Mrs. Atherton read it standing up, turning pages with the steady pace of someone who reads figures for pleasure as well as information. And at the end, she said that whoever had put this together had a clear eye and a good instinct for what mattered and what did not. She did not ask who had done it. She looked at Susanna and waited. "I kept them," Susanna said, "because someone needed to." "Yes," said Mrs. Atherton. "That is generally how things get done." This was the beginning of an alliance that was never formally declared, which made it more durable. Mrs. Atherton began teaching Susanna the still-room accounts within the week, sitting with her each afternoon over the estate's supply records with the patient, specific generosity of a woman who has learned that knowledge is better shared than hoarded. She also, in those sessions, absorbed the kitchen gossip that flowed around and past Susanna like water around a stone. Not idle gossip, but the kind that maps the social weather of a household. And she processed it with the equanimity of a woman who has seen several versions of every drama a house can produce, and found most of them manageable. When the senior laundry maid, a woman named Bessett, who had been at the hall for 15 years and did not easily revise her hierarchies, made a remark within earshot of Susanna about the presumption of lower staff who ate above their station, it was Mrs. Atherton who addressed Bessett in a voice so quiet and pleasant that the content of what was said did not reach Polly, hovering at the passage door, but whose effect was visible in Bessett's expression for the rest of the week. It was Lady Cornelia who brought the chess set to light. She had arrived 10 days after the Duke, in a hired post-chaise from her house 12 miles distant, a modest property left to her by her late husband that she maintained with fierce economy, and occasional visits from the few members of the Ravenscourt family she still found tolerable. She was 81, or claimed to be, though she gave the impression of a woman who had decided on an age and seen no particular reason to advance from it. She was small and very upright, with white hair dressed in a style that had not been fashionable for 30 years, and eyes of the same particular grey as her great-nephew's. She wore silk, always, on the grounds that she had earned it, and her rooms in the north wing, opened and aired for her arrival by Mrs. Atherton with lavender water and fresh beeswax, smelled of the dried rosemary she kept in flat dishes on the windowsills, and of old silk, and of the particular cool sweetness of rooms that have been carefully maintained by someone who considers maintenance a form of loyalty. She had written the letter in the damson-coloured sermons book. She knew it had not reached Edward because nothing had changed, and she was not a woman who confused silence with action. She had written 3 letters, in fact, one to the solicitor, one to a cousin who sat in Parliament and had some small influence in legal matters, and one to the Duke himself. and none of them had produced any visible result, which she attributed not to the failure of the letters, but to the failure of the men who received them to act with appropriate urgency. She had then done what a woman of her position and her era could do, which was to watch and wait and maintain. And she had maintained because she had believed, with the quiet stubbornness of a woman who has outlived everyone who disagreed with her, that the true master would return. Jonas had said the same thing about the rose. When Lady Cornelia was introduced to Susanna, she looked at her for approximately 4 seconds and then said, "Yes, sit down." Susanna sat. Lady Cornelia asked her 3 questions about the house accounts, 2 about the state of the kitchen garden, and 1, without transition, about whether she played chess. Susanna said she did not. Lady Cornelia said that was a deficiency she intended to remedy. This was not proposed as a question. The chess set was in a cabinet in the library, wrapped in a green baize cloth beneath 2 volumes of agricultural surveys that had clearly been placed on top of it as a form of protection against casual discovery. Lady Cornelia unwrapped it herself, with the decisive efficiency of someone reclaiming property. The board was inlaid rosewood, the squares worn to a near uniformity at their centres from decades of play, and the pieces were carved ivory and ebony in a style that owed something to the preceding century. One of the rooks, the black one with the small tower on its base, had its pedestal cracked away, and it stood slightly lower than the others on the board, listing very slightly to the left, as though leaning out to see around a corner. Lady Cornelia set it in its square without comment. She had played with the broken piece for 40 years, and had never found its absence of a base to constitute a disadvantage. She taught Susanna the game over 4 afternoons, starting with the rules and moving quickly to the principles, because she had no patience for instruction that remained at the level of the rules. Susanna was a quick student, not because she had any particular intuition for the game initially, but because she understood cause and consequence with the pragmatic directness of someone who has managed a household on insufficient resources, which is, Lady Cornelia told her, essentially what chess is about. On the 5th evening, the Duke appeared in the library at 8 o'clock, with no particular explanation, and sat across the board from Susanna. She had not been expecting this. She had the white pieces because Lady Cornelia, who was watching from the chair by the fire with a small glass of Madeira, had arranged it that way without comment. The room was lit by 3 candles on the mantel and 1 between the players on the table, and the light made the worn rosewood squares look like topography. The higher polished edges brighter, the worn centres receding into warmth. The Duke looked at the board, then at her, and moved a pawn. They played for an hour and a half. He won, but it required more time than he had expected, and Susanna made 1 exchange in the middle game that caused him to pause for a full minute before responding. He said, afterward, that she played like someone who did not object to losing a piece if it gave her something useful for it. She said that was a reasonable approach to most problems. He said nothing to that, but he came back the following evening. The games became the rhythm of the weeks that followed. The Duke arrived at 8. They played until the candles had burned well down, and in the gaps between moves they talked, haltingly at first, then with more ease, then with the kind of fluency that develops when 2 people have found a shared language and are testing its range. They talked about the estate. They talked about the tenants. He asked her one evening about the Hartley children she had built the fire for on the night he had watched from the tack room. She did not know he had seen that, and the reference stopped her mid-move. He said he had seen it through the kitchen window. She looked at him across the board and then looked back at the pieces. She moved her bishop. His boots on the gravel path below the east wing were audible from the long gallery each evening at 10 minutes before 8, which Polly had established by the second week and reported to Mrs. Atherton with the solemnity of a significant discovery. Mrs. Atherton received this intelligence with equanimity and said she would ensure the library fire was laid before 7. It was sometime during the third week of these evenings that the Duke stopped arranging himself. This is the precise way to describe what had been happening up to that point. He had been presenting himself. Not falsely. He was not a man given to performance, but with the careful, slightly effortful quality of someone aware of being assessed and unwilling to fail the assessment. He had been considered in his speech, measured in his humour, consistent in his attention. All of this was genuine, but it was also composed in the way a good letter is composed, meaning what it says and still shaped for an audience. Somewhere in the fourth week, the composition loosened. It began with a mistake. He lost the game through impatience, moved too quickly after one of her longer pauses, and the expression that crossed his face when he saw the consequence 3 moves later was completely unguarded, a flash of pure, unarchitectured frustration that he then laughed at, briefly, before he could stop himself. It was the laugh of a man surprised into it, and it was the first laugh she had heard from him that did not carry any consciousness of being a laugh. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then he arranged the pieces for another game. But after that he was slightly different. He argued with her about tenant policy, in a way that showed he had actual opinions rather than considered positions, and when she disagreed with him on the question of the mill repair schedule, he pressed back rather than conceding gracefully, and she pressed back again, and they went around twice before arriving at an agreement that neither of them had started with. He forgot, the following Thursday, to offer the correct formal opening when she came into the library, and instead said, without looking up from the board, "I've been thinking about what you said about the Southfield drainage, and I believe you are right about the secondary channel, but wrong about the cost." She sat down, poured herself a small cup of the tea Mrs. Atherton had left, and said, "Tell me why." This was the version of him that was harder to arrange a response to. The formal version was navigable because its distances were fixed and comprehensible. This one moved unpredictably, and it took up more space in a room, and it had a quality of presence that the formal version kept at managed remove. It was around this time that she moved the dining table. She had said nothing to anyone, including Mrs. Atherton, and had simply done it on a Friday afternoon while the long gallery was empty, recruiting Thomas Crane, who asked no questions and helped with the practical efficiency of a man who had learned not to expend comment on things he approved of. She had a small round table moved from the sitting room, one that seated 2 with comfort and perhaps 4 with goodwill, positioned at the end of the formal dining room nearest the fireplace. The great oak board that had previously defined the room's character, the one that ran 17 feet under its dustcloth, and had hosted formal dinners for 20 under the Dowager's governance, remained against the wall, draped, superseded. She laid the small table herself. 1 cloth, 1 candlestick, 2 covers. When the Duke came down to supper that evening and found the dining room rearranged, he stopped in the doorway. He looked at the long table against the wall, and then at the small round one with its single candle. And then at Susanna, who was moving the soup tureen from the sideboard with the expression of someone who has done a straightforward thing and intends to stand behind it. He sat down. He ate the soup, and then the second course, and then the remainder of the meal, with a quality of ease that had not previously been present at any meal in that house in recent memory. And at the end he sat back in his chair and looked at the candle flame for a moment before he looked up. He said nothing. He was not, Susanna had learned by then, a man who spoke when silence would do. He pushed his chair back, stood, and said good night, and went toward the library. The following morning he found Mrs. Atherton in the still room and told her, in the same efficient tones he used for all logistical matters, that the small round table in the dining room was to remain as it was. Mrs. Atherton said she understood entirely, And after he left, she stood for a moment in the still room, smelling of lavender and beeswax, looking at the wall with an expression of tranquil satisfaction that she did not share with anyone, but which Polly, passing the door at the wrong moment, intercepted and filed away as confirmation of something she had been waiting to have confirmed. What was developing in those evenings, in the library and in the dining room, and in the slow space between chess moves, had no name that either of them had applied to it. This was partly because naming it felt premature, and partly because neither of them was, by temperament, a person who named things until they had established that the thing would last. But there was something else operating beneath that restraint, something that had not yet surfaced. The Duke had still not told her why he had left England. He had returned, and he had declared himself, and he had begun with an earnestness that was all the more striking for being entirely unperformed, the work of proving himself worthy of the answer she had asked for. But the 11 years were a presence in the room each evening, a long silence behind everything that had been said, and Susanna, who understood that some questions could not be asked and had to be invited, had not asked. She had waited with the same practical patience with which she waited for preserved fruit to reach its setting point. The moment would come when it was ready, and forcing it before then would only ruin the batch. The question was whether she would still be at Yardwood when it did, because 3 weeks after her arrival, Lady Annabel Carstairs had begun making inquiries in town about the estate's new arrangements, and the nature of those inquiries was not administrative. Good. I've written Block 3. Let me check. 1. Does it cover Act 3 material? Yes, Mrs. Atherton, Lady Cornelia, chess set, dining table, Duke becoming himself 2. Named characters: Mrs. Atherton, Lady Cornelia. Bessett, laundry maid. Thomas, referenced. Polly, referenced. 3. Physical anchor: chess set, worn rosewood, broken rook. Lavender sachets, beeswax candles. 4. No repetition of Block 1 to 2 material beyond permitted callbacks. 5. Rhythm: multiple register shifts, description to character, introduction to dialogue to scene, to internal reflection, to dialogue, to consequence. 6. Narrator voice: no direct emotional naming, all conveyed through physical detail and action. 7. Ends with open question/pivot to Act 4, Lady Annabel's inquiries. 8. The rose cutting is not belaboured, but the physical anchor is the chess set. 9. Length: this is a solid block, should be well over 2,400 words. The block covers Mrs. Atherton's arrival and character, the box staying by the door, brief continuation from Block 2, Lady Cornelia's arrival and character, the chess set discovery, Susanna learning chess, the nightly games, the Duke's gradual shift to authenticity, the dining table scene, end pivot to Act 4. I think this is solid. Let me verify I haven't repeated things. Rose cutting. Mentioned only in passing reference. Lady Cornelia/Jonas connection noted without repeating the detail. The eye contact in the rain. Not mentioned. The proposal speech. Not mentioned in detail. The church scene/Mrs. Denley. Not mentioned. Good. The pivot at the end is clear. Lady Annabel is coming into the story. The block ends without farewell or wrap-up language. The box stayed by the door for 4 days. No one moved it. This was partly practical. Susanna was, after all, still employed, the Duke having made no contrary instruction. And partly something else. The kind of institutional hesitation that descends on a household when the rules it has operated under have been publicly dismantled and the new ones have not yet been handed down. Polly walked around it each morning, with the careful lateral arc of someone navigating a sleeping dog. Thomas carried his coal scuttle past it with his eyes front. Mrs. Platt, whose relationship with ambiguity was largely domestic and could not extend to symbolic luggage, finally draped a clean cloth over it on the third morning, which solved the visual problem without addressing any other kind. Susanna herself did not look at it. She went about the work of the kitchen with her accustomed focus, which, in the days following the steward's removal, had expanded considerably. Because a household that has been run tightly by intimidation discovers, when the intimidation is withdrawn, an astonishing number of things that have been deferred. The larder needed a full inventory. The servants' hall coal was 3 weeks behind where it should be for November. The east wing's broken window, boarded since August, was admitting a thread of wind that had found its way by some architectural argument through 2 corridors and into the back stairwell. Susanna addressed these things in sequence, not because anyone asked her to, but because they were there, and she was the person who had noticed them. It was in the middle of this self-appointed effort, specifically while she was on her knees beside the larder floor, recounting the preserved goods and noting with controlled disapproval that 6 jars of the summer's damson preserve had been quietly removed from the shelves without record, that she heard the sound of a carriage on the front drive, which no one had used since the Dowager Helena's departure. Mrs. Atherton arrived on a Wednesday in late November with 2 trunks, a hat box, and a reputation that had preceded her by about 36 hours. The Duke had written to her the previous week, apparently with the same efficiency he applied to all logistical problems: finding the right person, making the offer in plain terms, and letting the answer constitute itself without embellishment. Margaret Atherton was a widow of 44 who had spent 8 years as housekeeper at Dawnfield Park on the Lincolnshire border before her employer's death had dissolved the household. She was plump in the way of a woman who takes pleasure in what the kitchen can produce and has no philosophical objection to the evidence. With quick brown eyes and the kind of unguarded expression that invites confidence without demanding it. She smelled of lavender, not in the effusive way of a woman over-applying a scent, but in the settled, pervasive way of a woman who keeps lavender sachets in every drawer and has done so for 20 years, so that the scent has become simply part of the atmosphere she carries. She found Susanna in the larder and introduced herself without ceremony. She said she had been told the household was in a state of reorganisation and that she preferred to see it herself rather than receive a summary. And could she begin with the accounts? Susanna handed her the ledger she had been keeping for the past 3 days, in the absence of any official record. Mrs. Atherton read it standing up, turning pages with the steady pace of someone who reads figures for pleasure as well as information. And at the end, she said that whoever had put this together had a clear eye and a good instinct for what mattered and what did not. She did not ask who had done it. She looked at Susanna and waited. "I kept them," Susanna said, "because someone needed to." "Yes," said Mrs. Atherton. "That is generally how things get done." This was the beginning of an alliance that was never formally declared, which made it more durable. Mrs. Atherton began teaching Susanna the stillroom accounts within the week, sitting with her each afternoon over the estate's supply records with the patient-specific generosity of a woman who has learned that knowledge is better shared than hoarded. She also, in those sessions, absorbed the kitchen gossip that flowed around and past Susanna like water around a stone. Not idle gossip, but the kind that maps the social weather of a household, and she processed it with the equanimity of a woman who has seen several versions of every drama a house can produce and found most of them manageable. When the senior laundry maid, a woman named Bessett, who had been at the hall for 15 years and did not easily revise her hierarchies, made a remark within earshot of Susanna about the presumption of lower staff who ate above their station, it was Mrs. Atherton who addressed Bessett in a voice so quiet and pleasant that the content of what was said did not reach Polly, hovering at the passage door, but whose effect was visible in Bessett's expression for the rest of the week. It was Lady Cornelia who brought the chess set to light. She had arrived 10 days after the Duke, in a hired post-chaise from her house 12 miles distant, a modest property left to her by her late husband that she maintained with fierce economy and occasional visits from the few members of the Ravenscourt family she still found tolerable. She was 81, or claimed to be, though she gave the impression of a woman who had decided on an age and seen no particular reason to advance from it. She was small and very upright, with white hair dressed in a style that had not been fashionable for 30 years, and eyes of the same particular grey as her great-nephew's. She wore silk, always, on the grounds that she had earned it, and her rooms in the north wing, opened and aired for her arrival by Mrs. Atherton with lavender water and fresh beeswax, smelled of the dried rosemary she kept in flat dishes on the windowsills, and of old silk, and of the particular cool sweetness of rooms that have been carefully maintained by someone who considers maintenance a form of loyalty. She had written the letter found in the Book of Sermons. She knew it had not reached Edward because nothing had changed, and she was not a woman who confused silence with action. She had written 3 letters, in fact, one to the solicitor, one to a cousin who sat in Parliament and had some small influence in legal matters, and one to the Duke himself. And none of them had produced any visible result, which she attributed not to the failure of the letters, but to the failure of the men who received them to act with appropriate urgency. She had then done what a woman of her position and her era could do, which was to watch and wait and maintain. And she had maintained because she believed, with the quiet stubbornness of a woman who has outlived everyone who disagreed with her, that the true master would return. Jonas had said the same thing about the rose. When Lady Cornelia was introduced to Susanna, she looked at her for approximately 4 seconds and then said, "Yes, sit down." Susanna sat. Lady Cornelia asked her 3 questions about the house accounts, 2 about the state of the kitchen garden, and 1, without transition, about whether she played chess. Susanna said she did not. Lady Cornelia said that was a deficiency she intended to remedy. This was not proposed as a question. The chess set was in a cabinet in the library, wrapped in a green baize cloth beneath 2 volumes of agricultural surveys that had clearly been placed on top of it as a form of protection against casual discovery. Lady Cornelia unwrapped it herself, with the decisive efficiency of someone reclaiming property. The board was inlaid rosewood, the squares worn to a near uniformity at their centres from decades of play, and the pieces were carved ivory and ebony in a style that owed something to the preceding century. One of the rooks, the black one with the small tower on its base, had its pedestal cracked away, and it stood slightly lower than its companions on the board, listing very slightly to the left, as though leaning out to see around a corner. Lady Cornelia set it in its square without comment. She had played with the broken piece for 40 years, and had never found its absence of a base to constitute a disadvantage. She taught Susanna the game over 4 afternoons, starting with the rules and moving quickly to the principles, because she had no patience for instruction that remained at the level of rules. Susanna was a quick study, not because she had any particular intuition for the game initially, but because she understood cause and consequence with the pragmatic directness of someone who has managed a household on insufficient resources, which is, Lady Cornelia told her, essentially what chess is about. On the 5th evening, the Duke appeared in the library at 8 o'clock, with no particular explanation, and sat across the board from Susanna. She had not been expecting this. She had the white pieces, because Lady Cornelia, watching from the chair by the fire with a small glass of Madeira, had arranged it that way, without comment. The room was lit by 3 candles on the mantel and 1 between the players on the table, and the light made the worn rosewood squares look like topography, the higher polished edges brighter, the worn centres receding into warmth. The Duke looked at the board, then at her, and moved a pawn. They played for an hour and a half. He won, but it required more time than he had expected, and Susanna made 1 exchange in the middle game that caused him to pause for a full minute before responding. He said, afterward, that she played like someone who did not object to losing a piece if it gave her something useful for it. She said that was a reasonable approach to most problems. He said nothing to that, but he came back the following evening. The games became the rhythm of the weeks that followed. The Duke arrived at 8. They played until the candles had burned well down, and in the gaps between moves they talked, haltingly at first, then with more ease, then with the kind of fluency that develops when two people have found a shared language and are testing its range. They talked about the estate and the tenants. He asked her, one evening, about the Hartley children she had built the fire for on the night he had watched from the tack room. She had not known he had seen that, and the reference stopped her mid-move. He said only that he had seen it through the kitchen window. She looked at him across the board, then looked back at the pieces and moved her bishop. His boots on the gravel path below the east wing were audible from the long gallery each evening at 10 minutes before 8, which Polly had established by the second week and reported to Mrs. Atherton with the solemnity of a significant discovery. Mrs. Atherton received this intelligence with equanimity and said she would ensure the library fire was work. It was Lady Cornelia who determined that Susanna would go to London. She announced this on the second Tuesday of December, in the library, in the tone she used for all decisions of consequence, which was the same tone she used for all decisions, there being no distinction in her mind between consequential and otherwise. She said that a woman who intended to become a duchess, whether she had yet said so formally or not, required a working understanding of the society she would be entering, and that remaining at Yardwood while the Duke conducted necessary business in town would achieve nothing except to give London a full season's head start on forming an opinion in her absence. She said this looking at Susanna directly, and she said it looking at the Duke directly immediately afterward, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then the Duke said he had intended to propose exactly this arrangement. "Then we are agreed," said Lady Cornelia, and opened her book. The arrangement, as it took its formal shape, had Susanna travelling to London as Lady Cornelia's companion, a social position with enough ambiguity to function as a temporary shelter while the more permanent categories sorted themselves out. She was not the Duke's betrothed. She had not accepted any proposal, there having been only one, which she had declined on terms everyone in the household understood, even if no one had spoken them aloud. She was not precisely a servant, nor was she a guest, nor was she a poor relation. That useful English fiction that accommodates so many uncomfortable realities by giving them a genealogical explanation. She was, for the moment, Susanna Hartley, who had refused the Duke and who had not been told to leave, and who was now driving to London in Lady Cornelia's travelling carriage with a second trunk that had been delivered to her room without explanation 3 days before departure, and which contained, among other items, 2 gowns she had not previously owned. She had looked at the gowns for a long time before she put them away. She had not asked for them, and had not been asked whether she wanted them. They were not extravagant. Lady Cornelia's taste ran to the precise and durable rather than the fashionable, but they were good. A grey-blue wool morning dress, and a deeper blue silk for evening. And they were made for someone of Susanna's measurements, which meant someone had provided those measurements to a modiste at some point before this trunk arrived. She folded them back into the tissue and left them where they were, and she did not mention them to anyone. Because sometimes the most dignified response to a kindness is to receive it without making it into a conversation. London in February was not the city of summer engravings. It was a city of raw wind off the river and coal smoke so dense it sat in the streets like a permanent weather condition. And the mud of the main thoroughfares was a substance with its own character, neither liquid nor solid, that claimed the hems of every garment within a quarter of an hour of exposure. The house the Duke kept in Brook Street had been opened and staffed in advance of their arrival, and Susanna's room, a decent room, 1 floor below Lady Cornelia's, with a view of the back garden rather than the street, was warm and clean, with a small fire already burning when she was shown up. She wore her plain York tan gloves everywhere she went those first weeks. They were her own, bought 3 years before in the village market, and they fit her hands as things do that have been worn in. And they were not fashionable, and she was aware that in the room she was now entering, they constituted a kind of statement. She made the statement deliberately. She was not prepared to let the city dress her into someone else before she had understood what the city was. She understood it quickly, because she was good at reading environments, and because Lady Cornelia, who had navigated London society since the 1750s and had developed during those decades a knowledge of its operations as precise as any surveyor's, taught her efficiently. The rules were not complex. They were simply the rules of any closed system in which status is the primary currency, and status is determined by recognition. And recognition can be manufactured or withdrawn by the people who control the principal social platforms. The season's arbiter was, as it had been for some years, a small number of women whose good opinion opened doors and whose disapproval closed them. And of this group, the most consistently attended to was Lady Jersey, who held a morning concert series in her Mayfair house each fortnight, and whose drawing room served as a kind of social exchange where values were quietly assessed and quietly revised. Lady Annabel Carstairs had been attending Lady Jersey's concerts since her first season at 18. She was 26 now, still unmarried, which in the vocabulary of her social circle required explanation, and the explanation available was that her standards were high, which was the polite version, or that the Duke of Yardwood had gone abroad, before the understanding her father had anticipated could be formalised, which was the more precise version. Lord Carstairs, her father, was a tall man, with the permanent expression of someone calculating in his head, which he generally was. He had put money into the Yardwood Estate's drainage works in 1809 at the Duke's father's request, on terms that had been, at the time, generous. And he had not called the debt in because he had expected that its forbearance would be the foundation of a matrimonial arrangement. A decade had passed without producing this arrangement, and Lord Carstairs' forbearance had curdled into something that functioned more like leverage. Lady Annabel had been aware of Susanna's existence since November. She had sources in precisely the way a woman of her social intelligence and her resources would have. A cousin who corresponded with a family in the neighbouring county, and a cousin's husband who had business dealings with Thorne's firm, and a paid companion named Mrs. Fowler, who could be depended upon to circulate in the correct rooms and note the correct conversations. She knew that the Duke had returned, that the steward had been removed, that the former cook's assistant had refused a proposal and had subsequently been brought to London under Lady Cornelia's protection. She knew all of this before Susanna's carriage had cleared the outskirts of the city, and she spent the days before the next Lady Jersey concert considering what to do with it. What she decided to do was efficient. She told the truth, and she framed it. The story she released, first at a card party at her father's house, where Mrs. Fowler positioned herself beside the correct 3 women and spoke in a register just below the level of the general conversation, was this: that the new so-called Duchess of Yardwood had been a serving wench who had trapped His Grace with a child she had later lost, or worse, that she was the byblow of the 5th Duke himself, and that Edward Ravenscourt had married her to keep the whole filthy business quiet. The story had the virtue of being unprovable in either direction, and the additional virtue of explaining everything that was otherwise inexplicable about the Duke's behaviour, which is always the quality that makes a story travel. By the morning of the next Lady Jersey concert, it had reached 11 drawing rooms. By the afternoon, it had reached 14. Susanna did not know any of this when she arrived at Lady Jersey's house on a Thursday morning in a hired chair with Lady Cornelia, wearing the grey-blue wool dress and her own York tan gloves. She had been to one previous Lady Jersey concert a fortnight before, at which nothing particular had happened, which Lady Cornelia had described afterward as a successful reconnaissance. This was the second. The room was warm with too many people, the way the better rooms of that season always were. Candles and bodies and the press of skirts and the accumulated scents of rice powder and beeswax and the faint perpetual undercurrent of coal. The musicians were already in their positions at the far end, 3 of them, and the chairs had been arranged in the French style, facing inward toward the performance. Lady Cornelia was claimed immediately by a small woman of her own generation at the near end of the first row, and Susanna took the chair to Lady Cornelia's right and looked at the musicians, and was looking at nothing in particular when the quality of the room shifted. She felt it before she understood it. A slight change in the temperature of the attention nearby, of the kind that she had learned to read in kitchens and servants' halls. The particular stillness of people who are watching something while pretending not to. She kept her eyes forward. The musicians began. The whispers began approximately 3 minutes into the first piece, and they were conducted in the practiced register of women who have learned to communicate completely without interrupting a performance. The barely turned head, the fan raised, the mouth behind it, the eyes moving. Susanna could hear none of the words. She could read every syllable of the situation. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the musicians, and she let 12 minutes of it pass, which was the time it took the first piece to end and the brief interval of retuning to begin. She used those 12 minutes to identify the particular cluster of attention and to work out what to do with it. The answer she arrived at had the simplicity she preferred in all solutions. Do nothing that requires explanation. The young woman who approached her during the interval was not what she expected. She was perhaps 20, plainly dressed by the standards of the room, though not plainly by any absolute standard, with a face that was anxious in the way of someone about to do something they have decided on despite the anxiety. She held an embroidered reticule in both hands, her mother's work unmistakably, the stitching dense and careful in the domestic pattern of a woman who had spent long evenings at her needle. She said, "Mrs. Ravenscourt? I am Miss Mary Chetwynd. My father is the vicar at Stowley. I have heard something said this morning that I believe you ought to know." Susanna said, "Please sit down, Miss Chetwynd." Mary Chetwynd sat. She delivered the rumour in its full form, concisely and without embellishment, looking at Susanna's hands rather than her face, and when she finished, she said that she knew it was not her place, but that it seemed worse not to have spoken. Susanna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You were quite right to tell me. Thank you." She said it in the same voice she used for kitchen instructions, unemphatically, with the weight behind it that comes from meaning the words without performing them. Mary Chetwynd looked up. Something in her expression rearranged itself into relief. Susanna turned and found Lady Annabel Carstairs across the room, without particular difficulty. She was exactly where a woman distributing a story would be, within reach of the principal clusters of conversation, her painted ivory fan half raised in a gesture between concealment and display. The fan was a beautiful object, its sticks carved with pastoral scenes in a delicate hand, and Lady Annabel used it with the fluency of long practice, snapping it open and drawing it across her lower face with a movement that managed to be both graceful and pointed. Susanna picked up her teacup. She held it steady, raised it to exactly the height of a deliberate toast, and looked directly at Lady Annabel across the 20 feet of warm, crowded room. She held the look for 3 full seconds. Then she set the cup down, turned back to Mary Chetwynd, and asked whether she enjoyed the first piece. Lady Annabel's fan stopped moving for a moment. Then it resumed. Mary Chetwynd stayed for the remainder of the concert, seated beside Susanna, and they spoke about the musicians and about the village of Stowley, and about whether the second piece had been the composer's or an arrangement. and it was an entirely ordinary conversation, conducted in full view of a room that was by then paying considerable attention to Susanna's composure, without receiving the performance it had assembled to watch. On the carriage ride home, Lady Cornelia said nothing for several minutes. Then she said, "You knew before I did." Susanna said, "I suspected before the first piece ended." Lady Cornelia was quiet again. Then she said, "And Annabel Carstairs?" Susanna said, "Her father is a creditor of the estate." Any direct response from the Duke would give her grounds for a countermove through Lord Carstairs. The rumour needs to die in the room, not be elevated by an argument. Lady Cornelia looked at her. She said, "Yes." Then she looked out at the grey London street and said nothing further. And Susanna understood that this constituted the highest form of approval available from that particular quarter. That evening, when the Duke called in Brook Street at his customary hour, Susanna told him she had had an agreeable morning and that Mary Chetwynd, the vicar's daughter from Stowley, was a young woman worth knowing. She said nothing about the rumour. This was a decision she had made in the carriage and was not uncertain about. She had handled the morning, and the handling had been correct, and bringing it to the Duke now would transform a managed situation into a crisis, and would additionally give him the information in a form that made him feel he had failed to protect her, which was not a feeling she wanted to generate and not a dynamic she intended to establish. She had refused to be a prize. She was also not prepared to be a problem requiring a rescue. She had, in short, decided to protect him from the knowledge. What she had not considered was that Thorn was in London. Thorn had been there for 3 weeks, conducting the estate's legal business in parallel with the social season, and he moved through a different layer of the city entirely. The layer of solicitors' offices and coffee house meetings, and the quiet, productive conversations between professional men that constitute the actual operating machinery beneath society's surface. He had heard the rumour within 4 days of its first circulation, because the professional layer and the social layer of London intersect at exactly the points where money and reputation overlap. And Lord Carstairs was a man with a foot in both. Thorn had not relayed it to the Duke immediately, because he was still assessing whether the practical legal dimension, Lord Carstairs' debt, its potential weaponisation, required addressing before the social dimension. He had determined, by the morning after the Lady Jersey concert, that the two were linked and that both needed addressing at once. He called in Brook Street that afternoon, was shown into the Duke's study, and delivered his report in the efficient, unembellished style of a man who respects the recipient's time and his own. The Duke heard it in its entirety without speaking. When Thorn finished, the Duke sat back in his chair and was silent for a moment that Thorn, who had known him for 6 years, recognised as the particular silence that precedes a decision, rather than a reaction. Then the Duke asked 2 questions. The exact wording of the rumour, as it had been reported to Thorn, and the current state of Lord Carstairs' debt to the estate. Thorn provided both. The Duke thanked him. In the brief, specific way he thanked people when he had already moved on internally to the next step, and showed him out. He then stood at the window of his study, looking at the Brook Street traffic for perhaps 5 minutes, with the chess set's broken rook, which he had brought to London in his coat pocket, for reasons he had not examined, turned between his fingers. What he felt was not, precisely, fury in the common sense. It was quieter than that. It was the focused, purposeful cold that settles on a man who has been waiting for the moment when the thing he loves is threatened in public, and who has now been given the coordinates. He put the rook down on the windowsill and went to write 3 letters. 1 to his solicitor, 1 to his man of business, and 1, brief, a single sentence, to Lord Carstairs. What he did not yet know, because Susanna had not told him, was that she had sat through the whispers at Lady Jersey's and handled the mourning herself, and that the woman he was preparing to defend had already, quietly, won the first round. That information would have altered the shape of what he was planning. It did not reach him before the plans were formed, which meant that by the time the Duke of Yardwood walked into the Ashworth ball, 3 weeks later, he carried two things: the righteous anger of a man defending someone he believed to be under siege, and a debt he did not know he owed her. 3 weeks passed between Lady Jersey's concert and the Ashworth ball, and in those 3 weeks a considerable amount of machinery was set in motion that only part of the household could observe. Here is what Susanna knew: that she had handled the mourning at Lady Jersey's, that Lady Cornelia had approved of the handling, and that the rumour was circulating, but had been visibly refused the performance it required. She had attended 2 further morning calls and 1 small dinner, and on each occasion she had conducted herself in a manner that denied the story its oxygen without directly engaging its content. The approach of a woman who has learned that a fire does not require argument, only the withdrawal of fuel. Here is what the Duke knew: that Thorn had told him the rumour and its source, that Lord Carstairs' debt to the Yardwood estate stood at £940 with accrued interest, that the Ashworth ball was the largest assembly of the early season, and that Lady Annabel Carstairs would be there, and that what had been set in motion required a public resolution rather than a private one, because the wound had been made in public and could not be sealed in a lawyer's office. What the Duke did not know, because Susanna had not told him, was that she had already sat through the Lady Jersey morning with full composure, raised a teacup across the room, and turned back to Mary Chetwynd to discuss the musicians. He had spent 3 weeks preparing to defend a woman under siege who had already, quietly, refused to be besieged. This did not change what needed to be done. It changed only the shape of what he owed her, in a way he would not fully understand until he was standing in the Ashworth ballroom looking at her face. There was one additional piece of information, and it belonged entirely to the Duke. The truth about why he had left England in 1808, which he had not told Susanna and had not told anyone, and which he had been carrying for 11 years in the way that men carry the weight of their worst moments. Not constantly, but reliably, in the specific posture of someone accommodating an old injury. He had decided, sometime in the days between Thorn's report and the Ashworth ball, that if he was going to speak in that room, he was going to speak all of it. There was no middle version available to him that was also honest, and honesty was, by this point, the only currency he had left. The Ashworth house in Grosvenor Square was lit from ground floor to roof line on the evening of the ball, the light spilling through every window onto the damp black street below, with the profligate warmth of a house that has no anxiety about its coal bill. The February cold had sharpened toward the end of the week into something that discouraged the merely curious, and the guests arriving in their carriages came quickly up the steps and through the doors with the efficiency of people who have dressed carefully and have no intention of allowing the weather to register its opinion. Inside, the heat was immediate and total. The Ashworth's ballroom occupied the full rear of the house, 2 stories in height, its walls hung with pale yellow silk that had yellowed further with candlelight over its years of use, and the effect was of a room existing in a permanent late summer evening, perpetually golden, perpetually warm, smelling of beeswax and hothouse flowers brought from somewhere at considerable expense, and arranged along the window embrasures in arrangements that were losing their freshness by the second hour. The press of bodies had its own heat layered over the candles, and the combined scent of powder and perfume and warm wool and perspiring propriety filled every inch of the space with a density that made the air itself feel textured. By 10 o'clock, the room was full and bright and loud, with the particular loudness of 200 people conducting private conversations simultaneously in a large enclosed space. And the musicians at the far end played through it, with the practiced, determined energy of people who are aware they are providing texture rather than entertainment. Susanna arrived with Lady Cornelia at 9, which was the correct hour. Not so early as to appear eager, not so late as to appear strategic. She wore the pale blue silk. It was the Duke's gown, not Lady Cornelia's. She had understood this when she looked at it closely enough to see that it was not Lady Cornelia's taste, but his. The cut precise without ornament. The colour the particular shade of a winter sky after rain. The fabric heavy enough to hang without fussing. She had put it on that evening without making it into a decision, because it was the correct gown for the occasion, and because sometimes accepting a thing is simply wearing it. At her bodice, pinned with the small silver pin from her own jewellery case, was a sprig of green, the rose cutting from Jonas's last surviving bush, now rooted and growing in a small clay pot in the window of the Duke's Brook Street study, from which she had taken a new slip that afternoon and wrapped in the same damp cotton that was her usual method. It was not decorative by any conventional measure. Polly, helping her dress, had looked at it and said nothing, which was Polly's way of withholding an opinion she had formed. Susanna had adjusted the pin and left it where it was. The Dowager Countess of Kenilworth was already in the room when they arrived, stationed in the chair she apparently considered her rightful position for all such gatherings, against the wall to the left of the main entrance, at an angle that permitted observation of both the door and the floor. She was 74, very thin, dressed in black as she had been for 15 years since Lord Kenilworth's death, in a manner that was less grief than declaration, and she held a quizzing glass of tortoiseshell and gold on a long handle, with which she periodically examined whatever in the room merited examination. She had known Lady Cornelia for 50 years, and disliked Lady Annabel Carstairs for 3. Having once witnessed Lady Annabel reduce a shy young debutante to tears at a musicale by the precise and deniable method of loudly admiring her gown in a tone that made it a mortification rather than a compliment. The Dowager Countess had not forgotten this, because she was a woman of excellent memory and broad moral accounting. When she saw Susanna, she raised the quizzing glass. Then she nodded once, in the manner of someone whose preliminary assessment has been confirmed by closer inspection. Mr. Chetwynd, the vicar of Stowley, was there because the Ashworths were among his family's oldest acquaintances, and because his daughter Mary had written to him with such particular urgency about Miss Hartley that he had felt it his duty to form his own opinion. He was a mild, careful man of 55, who had conducted himself with probity in his living for 23 years, and who found London society somewhat brighter and faster than he found comfortable. And he had positioned himself at the edge of the room near the refreshment table, with a glass of claret he had not yet drunk, watching the proceedings with the interested detachment of a man observing a species in its natural habitat. He saw Lady Annabel Carstairs move before Susanna did. He saw it because he was not dancing, and had no conversation requiring his full attention, and because Mary's letter had described Lady Annabel precisely enough that he recognised her immediately. The painted ivory fan, the precise and cultivated grace of her movements, the particular quality of a beautiful woman navigating a room as a performance. She had been at the far end of the floor during the first 2 dances, in conversation with 2 women Mr. Chetwynd did not recognise, and she had been watching Susanna's position in the room with the dedicated peripheral awareness of someone who has been tracking a target and is waiting for the correct geometry. The correct geometry arrived in the 3rd dance. Susanna had been standing with Lady Cornelia at the side of the floor, watching the set form, and she had just accepted a cup of negus from a passing footman, when the other guests near her shifted slightly. The subtle, collective redistribution of the crowd that opens a channel without appearing to. And Lady Annabel was there. She was close enough that there was no question of pretending the address was not public. She said, in a clear, carrying voice that was pitched to travel in precisely the direction of the maximum number of people, "Miss Hartley. Or I suppose we are to say, Mrs. Ravenscourt now, are we? You will forgive us if we find the title somewhat aspirational, given the rather extraordinary circumstances of your rise. Some of us have been trying to determine exactly which story is true, though I confess all of the stories we have heard are, in their several ways, so very illuminating. The music from the previous dance had ended. The musicians were retuning. In the gap, the carrying voice carried. Susanna set her cup down on the nearest surface, the ledge of the window embrasure, precisely placed, without looking at it. She looked at Lady Annabel and said nothing. Lady Annabel continued. She said that no one present wished to cast doubt on the Duke's charity, which was widely known to extend, it seemed, to remarkable lengths. She said that a man who had been abroad for 11 years and returned to find his estate in ruin might be forgiven for being susceptible to any comfort available, and that the form that comfort had taken was, perhaps, a private matter, though society would be forgiven for noticing it. She said all of this with a smile so steady and a manner so pleasant that a person at the far edge of the room would have seen only a gracious woman in conversation. The people near the centre of the room saw what was on Susanna's face, and what was on Susanna's face was nothing at all. Not coldness, not fear, not the performing composure of someone managing a reaction, but the actual stillness of a woman who has decided that she will not give the proceeding what it requires. Her hands were at her sides. The rose sprig at her bodice was very green against the pale silk. Then the Duke stepped onto the floor. He had been at the far end of the room in conversation with his host and had heard the beginning of it from 30 feet away, which was close enough to understand the architecture of what was happening. He crossed the floor without hurry, not slowly exactly, but without the urgency that would have turned the crossing into a scene before he arrived. People moved. They did not precisely part, but they found themselves, in the moment before he reached the centre, at a slight distance from it. He took Susanna's hand. Not her arm, her hand, the right one, which he raised slightly as though they were beginning a dance, and which he held with the particular firmness of a man who is stating a position rather than offering a comfort. He looked at Lady Annabel. Then he looked at the room. He spoke at a volume calibrated for the room, which had gone very quiet in the way of rooms that are collectively holding a breath. He said, "You have been told a story about this woman and about me. I am going to tell you the correct one, because it is the only one I am willing to leave in this room." He said, 8 weeks ago, I arrived at my own estate after 11 years abroad, travelling without announcement, wearing a borrowed coat. It was raining. This woman, he did not gesture, he did not need to, came out of the kitchen door into the rain to find me at the gate, and pressed food into my hands because I appeared to need it. She did not know who I was. She did not calculate what she might gain by the act. She did not hesitate. She gave me what she had and returned inside. And I stood in the yard at my own gate in the dark and understood, for the first time in 11 years, that I had been a coward. The room was entirely still. He continued. He said that he had left England in 1808, following the death of his younger brother Henry in a riding accident on the Yardwood grounds, and that he had allowed himself to believe, because it was easier than the alternative, that his absence was a form of penance, or a form of necessity, or a form of something that had a name other than what it was. He said it was flight. He said that a woman who ran out into a cold yard to feed a stranger had taught him that the people who depended on the Yardwood name could not eat his remorse, and that his brother, who had been a generous and clear-eyed man, would have said so directly and with considerably less patience than Susanna had shown. He said, "She saved my house. She kept my household together through circumstances that were not her responsibility, and at personal cost she has never named. She refused my proposal because she did not want to be treated as a solution, which she was correct to do. I am honoured to call her Duchess. And I am saying so now, in this room, because the alternative, allowing a slander constructed from malice and marital disappointment to circulate without my answer, is not something I am willing to do. He turned to Lady Annabel. His voice did not change in volume, but something in it changed in quality, in the way a room's atmosphere changes when a window opens in winter. He said, "Your father's debt to the Yardwood estate will be called in full tomorrow morning. I trust he has the means to address it." The ivory fan snapped shut. Lady Annabel held her position for perhaps 3 seconds, which was long enough for every person within viewing distance to note that she was not going to find a response. And then she walked toward the door. She walked with great steadiness and considerable speed, and the crowd, which had no desire to be associated with the losing position in a public reckoning of that magnitude, redistributed itself in her wake with the smooth efficiency of water finding its new level. From across the room, the Dowager Countess of Kenilworth raised her quizzing glass. She held it for a long, considered moment, then lowered it and addressed the woman seated next to her, with a remark that was not audible from the centre of the floor, but whose reception, a small, involuntary laugh, quickly controlled, carried. Mr. Chetwynd, still at the edge of the room beside the refreshment table, set down his untouched claret. He looked at Susanna's face, and what he saw on it he would describe to his daughter Mary in a letter he wrote the following Sunday before the morning service, as the expression of a woman hearing something she had not expected to be told, in that manner and in that room, and finding that she had no prepared response for it, which was so entirely unlike her that it constituted, in his pastoral opinion, the most affecting thing he had witnessed in recent memory. What Susanna had not expected was the brother. She had not known. She had watched the Duke across 3 months of chess games and dining-room suppers and morning estate discussions, and she had known that there was something at the back of the 11 years that had not been spoken. Something that was not simply indifference or negligence, but had a weight to it, a specific gravity. She had waited, as she had said she would. She had not expected to receive the answer in a ballroom, with 200 people listening. The Duke was still holding her hand. She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her. Not with the memorising focus of that first night in the rain, which had been the look of a man taking inventory of something unexpected, but with a directness that had earned itself through 3 months of chess moves and disagreements about drainage schedules and a dining table rearranged without permission. He looked at her as a man looks at the one person in a room whose response matters. She was, very briefly, entirely unable to decide what to say. Around them, the room was beginning to breathe again. The musicians, who had stopped with the general cessation of movement, consulted each other and began the next piece. The floor refilled with gradual, self-conscious normality. Lady Cornelia appeared at Susanna's left, with the quiet inevitability of a woman who has navigated every variant of this scene in 50 years of attendance and knows exactly when to materialise. She said nothing to either of them. She simply stood there, in the warm, over-scented air of the Ashworth ballroom, and let the moment be what it was. The Duke said, quietly, for Susanna only, "I should have told you first. Before tonight. I know that." She looked at the floor for a moment, then up at him. She said, "Yes, you should have." He nodded. He had not expected forgiveness immediately and was not asking for it. He was simply acknowledging the account, which she had always appreciated. They did not speak again in the ballroom. He led her through one dance because not dancing after that declaration would have created a different kind of spectacle. And they moved through the set with the careful attention of 2 people navigating a shared space that has recently been significantly rearranged. Afterward, he returned her to Lady Cornelia and went to find Thorn, who had been standing near the card-room door for the past 20 minutes, with the expression of a man whose professional advice has been exceeded by events, but who considers the outcome defensible. Susanna stood in the warm, golden room and touched the rose sprig at her bodice with one finger, not adjusting it, only confirming that it was still there, and looked at the floor where the thing had happened. And the floor looked exactly as it had before. Outside, the February cold pressed against the window glass, and somewhere in the carriage queue on Grosvenor Square, Lord Carstairs was being handed into his vehicle with the bearing of a man who has just discovered that his leverage has changed hands in the past 10 minutes, and who is doing the arithmetic with increasing urgency. What had not yet happened, what was still unresolved between Susanna and the Duke, beneath the declaration and the recovered composure and the single quiet dance, was the private accounting. He had asked her once, and she had told him no, not like this, and she had meant it. And everything that had followed had been his answer to what she had meant. But the answer had arrived first in a room of 200 strangers, and the two of them had not yet stood alone together, with all of it spoken, and found out whether it was enough. They did not speak in the carriage. This was not awkwardness. The silence had a different texture than that. The texture of two people who have said a great deal in a very loud room, and have not yet found the private register for any of it. Lady Cornelia sat opposite them, with her hands folded over her reticule and her eyes closed, which was either exhaustion or a considered act of privacy. And given that she was Lady Cornelia, the two possibilities were not mutually exclusive. The city moved past the carriage windows in cold, indifferent panels, a torchlit doorway, a gutter running with February rain, the white face of a building, and then the black gap of an alley, and then another building. And Susanna watched it with the deliberate attention of someone who needs an occupation for her eyes while her mind is working. The Duke sat with his forearms on his knees and his head slightly down, and once, at a long pause in the traffic near the corner of Piccadilly, he turned and looked at her profile in the dark, for long enough that she became aware of it without turning. She did not turn. The carriage moved again. At Brook Street, he handed them both down. Lady Cornelia received her hand, crossed the pavement with the unhurried step of a woman who has discharged her evening's obligations with complete satisfaction, and went inside without looking back. The Duke stood on the step in the damp, cold air. He said, not quite calling after Susanna, who was already at the door, but clearly intended for her. "Tomorrow morning, if you are willing." She paused with her hand on the railing. She said, "Yes." She went inside. He stood on the street a moment longer in the February dark, and then he went around to the side entrance. Because it was his own house, and he had never quite remembered to use the front. In the morning, she found him already in the study. He had been there since early, by the evidence. The fire was well established. The desk held a cup that had been refilled at least once, and Thorn's most recent letter lay open beside an ink bottle with the pen set across it at the angle of something recently put down. The rose cutting stood in its small clay pot on the window ledge in the thin March light, a week past the stage of being a cutting, and now a thing with two new leaves, pale green and slightly translucent at their tips in the morning sun. It had been there since January, when Susanna had moved it from the sideboard because the window light was better, and the Duke had made no comment then or since. She took the chair across from the desk, which was the chess chair, the chair that had been hers for 3 months. He closed Thorn's letter. He said, "I owe you an accounting." She said, "You owe me 2, actually." Something moved in his expression. He waited. She said that she had known about the rumour before the ball. She told him about Lady Jersey's concert, the whispers behind the fans, the 12 minutes of it before the interval, Mary Chetwynd coming to warn her. She told him about the teacup. She told him that Lady Cornelia had understood the strategy immediately and said yes, and that by the morning of the ball, the story had been in circulation for 3 weeks and had not produced the result Lady Annabel had intended. Because a story requires a visible wound in order to grow, and she had declined to provide one. She said, "I handled it before you spoke." He absorbed this in the way he absorbed most things, without immediate expression, with the quality of attention that meant it was being taken seriously. Then he said, "I didn't know." She said, "No, that is the accounting you owe me." He leaned back in his chair. He said, "Thorne told me the rumour, and I planned a response without asking you whether you had already made one. I made an assumption about what you needed that I had no basis for, and I acted on it in a room of 200 people." She said, "Yes." He said, "I would like to say that I regret the manner of it more than the content, but I am not certain the content was mine to deliver in that form either." She was quiet for a moment. The thin sun moved behind a cloud and the room went briefly grey, and the 2 new leaves of the rose cutting flattened slightly in the change of light. She said, "The content was true, and it needed to be said publicly. The manner, I'm still deciding about the manner." He looked at the desk. Then he said, "My brother." She waited. He said that Henry had been 22 when he died. He said they had argued that morning in the yard over a matter that he could no longer recall with any precision. Some point of estate management, some disagreement that had the urgency of the immediate and none of the importance of anything lasting. He said Henry had taken the horse out at speed in the state of mind that follows an argument, which was Henry's habit when he was angry, and that he had known this and had let him go. He had been standing in the yard, watching the horse clear the gate, when the groom beside him said, in the manner of someone stating a fact for the record, "That horse is too fresh for this pace on wet ground." He had said nothing. He had gone inside. 40 minutes later, the groom had come to find him. There was nothing in the study but the fire and the thin sound of the street and the quality of silence that exists after a thing has been said that has not been said before. He said, "He would have gone regardless. I know that. What I have not been able to, what took 11 years, was that I know it with my reason, and I have always known it, and it has never been sufficient." Susanna looked at his hands, which were flat on the desk. She said, "Henry would have told you that a fact that can be known with the reason is known, regardless of what the other part of you insists on doing with it." He looked up. She said, "You said as much yourself, that he was a clear-eyed man." He was still for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Yes, he would have." She stood, crossed to the window and stood beside the rose pot with her back to him for a moment, looking at the grey March garden below. The 2 new leaves were entirely themselves now, not the cutting she had pressed into a stranger's palm in a cold November yard, but the thing it had been in the process of becoming all along, given soil and water and a window with adequate light. She picked it up and turned it so the younger growth faced the glass. Behind her, she heard him get up from the desk. He came to stand beside her at the window, and they were both looking at the garden when he said, "I want to ask you again." She set the pot back on the ledge. He said, "Not because you need to be recompensed, or because I am settling a debt, or because it is the reasonable and logical outcome of 3 months of evenings in a library. I am asking because I have spent 11 years arranging myself at a careful distance from everything I was afraid to lose again, and you are the person who has most thoroughly declined to accommodate that arrangement, and I find I am no longer interested in the arrangement. I am asking because I would like the rest of my life to be in the same room as you." He was not looking at her. He was looking at the garden, in the way of a man who has said the most unguarded, true thing he knows how to say, and is giving the recipient space to receive it without the additional weight of being watched. She looked at the rose. Then she looked at him. She said, "Yes." He turned. She said, "That is my answer. Yes." What crossed his face then was not the controlled and measured expression she had spent 3 months learning to read, but something beneath it, a brief, complete unguarding of the kind she had seen once before, when he had lost the chess game through impatience and laughed before he could stop himself. It lasted only a moment, but it was the realest thing she had seen in that study. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him have it. They returned to Yardwood in the middle of March, on a morning when the elm avenue had achieved the first tentative green of the season. Not the full canopy that the avenue had been before the storm took 3 trees, but the particular soft brightness of new leaves at their earliest stage, when each one is still more promise than fact. The gaps in the canopy let the spring sky through in long, pale rectangles, and the drive had dried enough from the winter to be solid underfoot, and the stone of the east wing had lost the particular flatness of winter stone and was showing its grain again in the early sun. Jonas was in the kitchen garden when the carriage came up the drive. He had been there since first light. He kept his own hours now, answering to no one except the weather and the seasons, which was a jurisdiction he found adequate. He heard the carriage and straightened, which took him longer than it once had, and he turned toward the gate. Polly was already at the kitchen door. She had a cloth in her hand, she had been polishing something, or pretending to, and she stood in the doorway with a quality of suppressed feeling that made her appear slightly larger than her actual dimensions. When she saw Susanna step down from the carriage, she took 2 steps forward and then stopped herself, because she had spent 3 months practicing the restraint of a senior member of staff, and she held to it until Susanna crossed the courtyard to her and said, "Polly, how are the damson preserves holding?" At which point Polly abandoned restraint entirely and produced a sound that was something between a greeting and a report, and which constituted, in its way, a full accounting of the past 3 weeks. Thomas Crane came through from the stable yard with an armful of split logs, as he generally appeared at any significant moment, usefully employed, peripheral, watching. He nodded once to Susanna, once to the Duke, and went on through the kitchen door with the logs without breaking his stride, which was Thomas's form of ceremony. Mrs. Atherton came out from the house with her hands folded and her expression settled, which in her case was as demonstrative as a brass band. She said that the rooms had been prepared and the fires were laid and the kitchen had managed perfectly well in Miss Hartley's absence, and that she would say no more than that, which meant she would say considerably more than that over the following days, none of it unwelcome. It was Jonas who stopped Susanna. He had come across the garden at his bent, deliberate pace, and he stood at the wall gate with his hands folded over his stick. He did not address the Duke. He looked at Susanna and he said, "The bush has put out new growth on the south side." She said, "Has it?" He said, 5 new canes since October. Never done that before, not in my time. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has made a promise and kept it, and is now satisfied to stand in the evidence of its having been worth keeping, and then he nodded and went back to his work. That evening was warm enough for the kitchen door to stand open. It was a mild March evening, the cold still present in the air but qualified. The cold that carries the first real suggestion of what is coming, rather than the cold that has forgotten what came before. The yard was dry and pale in the moonlight, the cobbles showing their individual characters in the white and shadow. And beyond the stable block, the elm avenue was a dark mass against a sky with enough cloud cover to make the moon a presence rather than a point, diffused and general, lighting the yard from no particular direction. Susanna stood at the door with the rose cuttings clay pot in her hands. It had made the journey from Brook Street, wrapped in Mrs. Atherton's best tea towel, by Susanna's instruction, and it had arrived intact, and she had put it on the kitchen windowsill when they came in, and then, after supper, picked it up again. For no reason she could have articulated, except that it seemed to belong at the door. The Duke came to stand beside her. He looked out at the yard, the same yard he had crossed 11 years ago, as a young man without enough sense to stay, and 8 weeks ago as a returned one, who had stood at the gate with a bundle of bread and mutton in his hands and looked at a lit kitchen window and understood something he could not yet name. He took her hand. His was warm, and the night was cold, and she was aware of both. The door stayed open behind them. Inside, the lamp on the kitchen table cast its square of light across the threshold and out onto the first 3 cobbles of the yard, a small, steady pool of it in the dark. The kind of light a house puts out when it has someone at home, to leave it burning.